Chapter 1. From the Saloon to the Sanctuary. The rain pounded against the church windows as Cassie Rose staggered through the door, drenched to the bone, her red silk dress clinging to her curves like temptation. She smelled of whiskey, roses, and something darker, something sinful that even the rain couldn't wash away. Reverend Elijah Cain had been kneeling in prayer, but the moment she appeared in the doorway, his thoughts scattered like ash in the wind. She leaned against the frame, eyes rimmed with kohl, lips swollen from too many stolen kisses, too many sinful nights. "I heard this was a place for broken souls," she drawled, voice thick with something dangerous. "Figured I'd fit right in." Elijah rose from the altar, his Bible still in hand. His pulse quickened, though he tried to ignore it. "Service ended 2 hours ago." "Well then," she smirked, "you've got me all to yourself." He should have told her to leave. He should have called for the sheriff, or at least pulled the door shut. But there was something about her, something deeper than lust, a pull like fate weaving its fingers through his soul. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. "Name?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Cassie Rose," she replied, licking rainwater off her lips. "Folks round here call me the preacher's mistake. Didn't they tell you that when you took this post?" The words hit harder than he expected. He stiffened, but didn't flinch. "I don't entertain gossip." Cassie's laugh was low, dark. "You will, especially when they see you talking to the woman who used to warm every outlaw's bed behind the saloon." He wanted to look away. He didn't. She stepped closer, her heels tapping lightly on the wooden floor, her eyes never leaving his. "You gonna pray over me, Reverend, or just stare like every other man?" He reached out to guide her out, but his fingers brushed her wrist, just a touch, and it was like a jolt of fire shot through them both. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, her voice barely above the storm outside. "You don't know what kind of fire you're playing with." "I was raised in fire," he replied, his voice rough. A crack of thunder shook the church as if heaven itself was warning them, but neither of them moved, neither of them stepped away. By morning, the church was empty again. Cassie Rose had disappeared like smoke, leaving only the faint scent of perfume and sin lingering in the air. Elijah knelt in prayer, but the memory of her voice, her eyes haunted him. The town was already talking, and he could hear their whispers, feel their judgment. But none of it mattered. Later that day, Deacon Wells approached him on the steps of the church, face tight with concern. "You've got to stay away from that woman," he hissed. "She's nothing but trouble." "She came seeking shelter," Elijah said quietly, his gaze far away. "She came seeking scandal," the deacon snapped. "Her kind always does." But Elijah wasn't listening, not to the deacon, not to the whispers. That night, when the rain returned and the thunder rolled like a warning, he opened the church door, and there she was again, standing in the doorway, waiting. This time, she didn't ask, and this time, he didn't stop her.
Chapter 2. Baptized in Shame. The second time Cassie Rose entered Elijah Cain's church, she didn't stumble. She sauntered. Gone was the red silk dress that had clung to her like temptation. In its place, a faded cotton skirt and a shawl that hung loosely on her shoulders. Yet the defiance in her eyes, that fire of something unholy, hadn't dimmed. It burned brighter, fiercer, like a woman who'd walked through hell and dared the flames to scorch her again. Elijah closed the church door behind her, the sound echoing in the silence of the sanctuary. His pulse thudded in his ears. The oil lamps flickered, casting long shadows across the pews, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. His heart raced, but his voice stayed steady. "You keep showing up," he said, the words heavy with something he couldn't name. She glanced around, taking in the stillness of the room. "You keep letting me in," she replied with a smile that was both a challenge and an invitation. He stood frozen for a moment, the air between them thick with unsaid things. He exhaled, forcing his breath to calm. "Why are you here, Cassie?" Her smile faltered just a fraction, the first crack in her armor. "Because I got nowhere else to go." She sat down in the front pew, the very one where the town's wealthiest widow sat every Sunday, looking out of place. Cassie was too wild for that seat, too bruised by life to fit neatly into this place of supposed salvation. "I wanted to believe I was more than what they called me," she murmured, voice raw. "But this town never forgets a woman's sins, especially when she wears 'em on her lips." Elijah sat beside her, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, too close and yet unable to move away. "What happened to you?" His voice was quieter now, more tender, though the question burned him from the inside. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the cross above the altar, her gaze so intense it seemed to reach beyond the stained glass windows, beyond the limits of the sanctuary itself. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "When I was 16, I got sold for 2 bottles of whiskey and a debt my father never paid. The man who took me, he beat me for 3 years. After he died, I walked into the saloon and never looked back." Her voice cracked, but she continued, her eyes never leaving the cross. "Men liked what they saw, and I let them take it. Better to sell something you already lost." Elijah swallowed hard, his throat thick with the weight of her words. "You didn't lose anything," he said, his voice strained. "They took it." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "You really believe that?" "I do." For a long moment the silence between them pulsed like a heartbeat. She studied him, searching his face as if daring him to recoil, to judge. But all she found was quiet sorrow and something deeper, more dangerous, longing. "Elijah," she whispered, voice trembling, "you're a preacher. I'm also a man. And what does a man of God want with a woman like me?" He reached out, gently, and took her hand, his fingers trembling just slightly. "Maybe God sent you here not to be judged, but to be seen." Her breath hitched, and she leaned closer, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, "What if I don't believe in God? Then believe in me." In that moment the world held its breath. Neither of them could stop it. Their lips met, soft, uncertain, and so wrong. Yet neither pulled away. The kiss was brief, fleeting, but it was enough. The sin had already been done, not in the kiss, but in the hunger that had risen between them, in the yearning that neither of them had known how to fight. Cassie broke away first, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. She stood, stumbling back as if the very air had burned her. "You can't do this," she whispered, voice fractured. "I already did," he said, his voice low and resigned. She didn't answer, only turned and fled into the night, her figure swallowed by the dark. A shadow passed by the stained glass window as she disappeared.
Neither of them knew someone had witnessed it, but the town would, and God might have.
Chapter 3. Fire on the Altar. By Sunday morning, the gossip had grown teeth. Cassie hadn't returned to the church since that kiss. She vanished like smoke, and still every tongue in town wagged with venom. Some claimed she'd bewitched the preacher. Others whispered they'd seen her sneaking out the back pew after dark. No one had proof. Until they did. It came from Deacon Wells' spinster sister, Agatha, a woman who considered suspicion her spiritual gift. She'd passed the church during the storm, seen the shadows dancing behind the stained glass, and noticed the way two bodies stood too close, too long. "I saw it," she hissed at the town council meeting, her voice sharp with self-righteous fury. "Our preacher locked in an unholy embrace with that Saloon harlot." The congregation erupted, gasps, stares, a few muttered prayers. By Tuesday, Elijah's name had become synonymous with scandal. The pews emptied, the tithe box stayed shut, and still he refused to defend himself. When asked if the rumors were true, he simply said, "I offered comfort to a soul in pain." They wanted shame. He gave them honesty. But not the whole truth. Not that her lips still haunted him. That they were the last thing he thought of when sleep refused him. Not that her laughter echoed in his mind like a memory he couldn't escape. That he still felt the ache in her eyes when she ran from him. He tried to pray it away, tried to starve it out with fasting and long nights on his knees. It didn't work. Cassie hid in the abandoned carriage house behind the mill, waiting for the heat to die down. The silence of the place was suffocating, but the guilt, it sat heavier than the shame. Elijah had risked everything, and she had vanished like a coward. Her heart thundered in her chest as she finally stepped out of the shadows, back to the church just after midnight, her cloak drawn tightly against the chill. Her eyes were hollow, haunted by the weight of her choices. The sanctuary was dark, except for the flicker of an oil lamp on the altar. Elijah sat in the front pew, alone. His back was straight, his posture tense, but when he spoke, his voice was soft. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said, without looking up. "I shouldn't have," she murmured, her voice heavy with regret. "You've lost everything." He turned slowly, his gaze steady. "I haven't lost you." She shook her head as if he had struck her. "Don't say that." "I have to," he replied, his voice resolute, "because loving you is the only thing I don't feel guilty for." She covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "They're going to burn you for this." "Then let them." "You'll lose the pulpit, the robe, the respect." "I'd rather lose 100 sermons than one more moment with you." She stared at him, trembling with emotion, her breath shallow. "You really would give up God for me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. His answer was quiet, steady, certain. "No, Cassie, I'd be finding God in you." And then their lips met again. No hesitation, no doubt, only fire. But outside, hidden in the shadows, someone stood watching, listening. And this time, they weren't coming with whispers. They were coming with torches. Chapter 4. The Fire Within. By the time the mob gathered at the church, the storm had turned from a rumble to a full-blown fury. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the stained glass windows, and the heavens seemed to be warning them all. The door to the church was flung wide, and there, framed in the dim light of the flickering oil lamps, stood Elijah Cain. His robe was drenched from the rain, his face set in hard lines, but there was something in his eyes, something fierce, that told them he wasn't going to bend, not this time. Behind him, Cassie Rose stood like a shadow, her chest heaving, but her expression was unwavering. "Get out of the way, preacher," Deacon Wells snarled, his voice carrying over the howling wind. "This is between you and the town." Elijah didn't move. He didn't flinch. He only looked at Wells, and then at the men behind him, the ones with torches, the ones with the looks of judgment already set upon their faces. "I'm not afraid of your torches," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "And I'm not afraid of you, Deacon." Wells sneered, stepping forward, his face twisted in disgust. "You've turned your back on God, Cain. You've sullied your position, and now you've chosen a woman like her?" "She's not the one who needs saving," Elijah shot back, voice rising. "It's this town, and it's you." The crowd, a mixture of the faithful and the curious, murmured in confusion. Eyes darted between Elijah and Cassie, disbelief written on every face. Cassie's gaze, however, remained locked on Elijah. She had never seen him like this, standing strong not for his pulpit, not for the church, but for her. The guilt that had gnawed at her since their first kiss felt lighter now. He was choosing her, and in return she would never let him fall alone. "You're wrong, Deacon," she said, stepping forward and raising her voice so that it cut through the tension. "I'm not here to take anything from him. I'm here because he saw me, not as a mistake, not as a sinner, but as a woman who needed saving, not from God, but from the world that abandoned her." The crowd stirred at her words. A few faces softened, but most hardened further. It wasn't enough to sway them. Wells sneered. "You've already damned him, and now you try to pull him further down with you." "I'm not pulling anyone anywhere," she snapped. "He's standing here of his own will, his own faith. You're the ones who made him feel like he had to hide." The deacon raised a hand, signaling to the men behind him. "Enough talk. Bring him out." At that moment, Elijah stepped in front of Cassie, blocking the door. He didn't speak, but his presence alone was enough to stop them cold. His gaze locked with Wells. No fear, no regret, only conviction. "You'll have to go through me," he said quietly. For a moment, the silence was thick with tension. The storm in the distance rumbled, and the wind howled, as if the heavens themselves were watching. "Then so be it," Wells spat, stepping forward with more force. "We've given you every chance. You've chosen your path, and now you will face the consequences." Before Elijah could respond, the deacon gestured, and two men rushed forward to try and shove him aside, but Elijah held his ground, a rock in the face of the tide. Cassie's heart hammered as she watched them struggle with him. She didn't want him hurt, not for her. But she wasn't going to let them drag him into their web of lies and cruelty either. She stepped out from behind him, her voice suddenly fierce. "You want him? You'll have to go through me first." The crowd paused, unsure what to make of the woman who stood, defiant and unafraid in the face of their judgment. She had seen pain and torment, but she had also seen love, true love, not the kind twisted by gossip and sin. She wasn't the villain in their story. She was his salvation. The torchlight flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the church steps. Wells looked to the men behind him. "Get them both, and let the town see what happens to sinners who defy God." But as they moved toward the door, the storm cracked open above, thunder roaring louder than their shouts. The air seemed to shift, the world spinning on the brink of something neither side could control. And in that moment, the town's judgment no longer mattered. What mattered was the fire burning between them, unquenchable, undeniable, and ready to consume them both.
The Preacher's Sinful Wife. Epilogue. Sanctuary. The church doors never closed again, but the pulpit remained empty. For months, no one dared stand where Elijah Cain had once preached fire and mercy. The cross still hung above the altar, but something had shifted beneath it. It was no longer a symbol of judgment, but of the messy, beautiful, human kind of grace. They left town on a Thursday. Cassie wore white, not a wedding gown, but a simple cotton dress. Clean, pure in a way no man could take from her. Elijah held her hand as they passed the same people who once cursed her name in whispers and shouted it in rage. They didn't stop to say goodbye. They didn't owe it. They crossed the river at first light, past the old mill and the field where she once cried behind a carriage house, shivering in shame. Now she laughed, head thrown back, face lifted to the sun. They built their new life 3 counties west, in a forgotten town called Mercy Hollow. No one asked about the red dress. No one cared that she had once been the most wanted woman behind the saloon curtain. To them, she was Mrs. Cassie Cain, and that was enough. Elijah never returned to the ministry. He opened a modest schoolhouse instead, where he taught letters and scripture, but never from behind a pulpit. He no longer needed to preach about salvation. He was living proof of it. Cassie became a midwife. She held the hands of women in pain, prayed with them, wept with them, delivered children, and sometimes buried them. The same hands that once poured whiskey now caught new life. People trusted her. Not because she wore a bonnet or quoted psalms, but because she understood. And one spring morning, as wildflowers crept across their porch and the air hummed with bees, Cassie placed Elijah's hand on her belly. He froze. "Is it?" She smiled. "It's hope, Elijah, growing inside me." He cried then, unashamed. And when their child came into the world months later, she was named Grace. Because that's what had followed them, chased them, even when they thought they didn't deserve it. Grace like rainfall on drought-struck earth, like love after shame, like silence after scandal. Back in their old town, the church eventually got a new preacher, a quiet man, safe. He never once spoke the name Cassie Rose, but some of the older folks remembered. They remembered how the church had once been shaken to its foundation, not by sin, but by truth, wrapped in passion. And in whispers, they'd say, "She changed him." But the wiser ones would smile and say, "No, he changed her, and she saved him right back." Because sometimes God sends storms to shatter the stained glass, so we can finally see the light.
If you enjoyed listening to this story, do well to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comment section. See you on our next video. Toodles!